probably heard it at some point, maybe from a relative, maybe from a horror movie. Someone digs up an old coffin, and the corpse inside has long, curling fingernails and hair spilling past the shoulders, grown wild in the dark. It's one of the oldest images in death folklore, the body that keeps growing after it's supposed to have stopped living. Vampires were said to show it. Ghost stories lean on it. Even exhumation reports from centuries ago describe bodies with nails that look like they've been growing for months underground. Here's the problem. It's not happening. Not even a little.
And the reason it's not happening isn't the boring answer you're expecting. It's not simply corpses don't grow hair, the end. What's actually going on inside a dead body over the following hours and days is stranger, more specific, and honestly more unsettling than the myth itself. Because your hair and your nails, right now, while you're alive and reading this, are already dead. Not metaphorically, actually dead. And once you understand what that means, the whole illusion falls apart, and something much stranger takes its place. One involving cells that keep functioning for days after a person is legally gone. Tissue that shrinks
unevenly across a corpse, an illusion that scientists have to formally correct for in real death investigations. And a version of this exact effect preserved on mummified bodies for over 1,000 years. So let's clear up the actual premise first. This myth isn't a case of people just imagining things. There is a real physical process happening in a body after death that makes it look like nails and hair are growing. It's just not growth. It never was. What's really happening is something closer to the body retreating. And by the end of this, you'll never look at that old coffin image the same way again.
Let's start with the part almost nobody explains properly. The hair and nails on your body right now are made of keratin, and keratin is dead tissue. Hardened, flattened, cross-linked protein with no blood supply, no nerve endings, no metabolic activity of its own. The only living part of the system is buried underneath, in the follicle and the nail matrix, tucked under the skin, where new keratin cells are actually produced and pushed upward. That living factory needs blood, oxygen, and glucose to keep dividing. The moment a heart stops and blood stops circulating, that factory shuts down instantly, not gradually. Not winding down like an engine running out of fuel. Off. There's no transition period, no lingering half hour of slow growth tapering to zero. The production line simply stops the second the power goes out, the same second everything else in the body starts its own shutdown. Except here's where it gets strange, because everything else doesn't actually shut down all at once. And this is the part that accidentally gave the myth its grain of truth. Death isn't a single instant for every cell in your body. It's a cascade, a wave that moves through different tissues at wildly different speeds. Brain cells are the most fragile of all. They start dying within minutes of oxygen loss, sometimes less. But skin cells, connective tissue, even the cornea of your eye are far more resilient. They can continue functioning, technically alive at a cellular level for 24 to 48 hours after a person has been declared dead. This is not a fringe theory. It's the entire basis for skin grafts and corneal transplants harvested from donors after death. Somewhere in a hospital, a surgeon is removing viable tissue from a person who died a full day earlier. The body doesn't turn off like a light switch. It turns off in waves, organ by organ, tissue by tissue, and that staggered shutdown is the first real clue that something more complicated than corpses stop growing hair is happening underneath this myth. So if the follicle stops producing new keratin instantly, why does it look like hair and nails keep growing at all? This is where the actual mechanism kicks in, and it's not uniform. It's not the whole body shrinking evenly like a grape turning into a raisin. Different tissue types around your nails and hair lose moisture at different rates because they're built from different materials. The skin of your fingertip is soft, fatty, loaded with collagen that holds water. The tissue directly around the nail bed and the follicle opening is thinner, denser, with a different collagen and fat composition entirely. When a body starts to dehydrate after death, these tissues don't shrink together. The skin around the nail retracts faster and further than the nail itself does, and the skin around the hair follicle recedes back from the shaft. The hair and nail haven't moved a single millimeter. The living tissue around them has pulled back, exposing more of what was always there. It's not growth.
It's recession. The illusion is created by everything around the keratin shrinking away from it, not by the keratin extending outward. And here's a detail that almost never makes it into any explanation of this myth. That retraction effect doesn't move in one direction. In the earliest stage of decomposition, before dehydration really takes hold, a body often goes through bloating, tissue swelling with gases produced by internal bacteria. Fingers can puff up, the face can swell. And during that stage, the opposite illusion happens. Nails can actually look shorter, sunken slightly into puffed up fingertip tissue. The reverse of the effect everyone talks about. It's only afterward, once the bloating subsides and dehydration takes over as the dominant process, that the retraction reverses direction and the classic long nails illusion appears. Most explanations skip this entirely and jump straight to dehydration, but the truth is the visual effect goes in two directions before it settles, and that settling has a specific timeline, which is something forensic researchers have actually mapped out. The illusion isn't constant from the moment of death.
Strengthens as dehydration accelerates and peaks somewhere between 24 and 72 hours post-mortem, right at the steepest part of the tissue's dehydration curve. After that window, the retraction slows and eventually plateaus once the surrounding tissue has lost about as much moisture as it's gonna lose. There's an actual peak, a specific window during which a body looks the most like it's still growing, and it's tied directly to the physics of how quickly soft tissue loses water, not to anything mystical happening underground. Now, here's something that supercharged this illusion for centuries without anyone realizing it. Embalming. Modern embalming fluid is specifically formulated to dehydrate tissue, quickly and aggressively, far faster than natural decomposition alone would manage. That's part of the point. It firms and preserves the body for viewing. But it also means an embalmed body at an open casket funeral can show this retraction illusion faster and more visibly than an unembalmed corpse ever would, sometimes within the very time frame of the funeral itself. Generation after generation of people stood over an open casket, looked at a loved one's hands, and saw exactly this effect firsthand. That's not folklore passed down through vague rumor. That's a physical illusion reinforced directly at the site where the myth would be most emotionally powerful, funeral after funeral, for as long as embalming has existed. Which raises an obvious question. If it's just soft tissue dehydration, does it actually matter to anyone outside a funeral home? It does, and forensic science is the proof. Investigators estimating time since death used to consider hair and nail length as one possible clue, and it turns out that method is notoriously unreliable, specifically because of this exact illusion. True keratin growth stopped at the moment of death. Apparent lengthening is just tissue retraction happening afterward on its own separate timeline. A forensic examiner has to actively distinguish between these two entirely different processes: real biological growth that already ended and a cosmetic illusion still unfolding, or risk miscalculating how long a body has been deceased. It's a distinction most true crime coverage skips over completely, treating hair and nail length as if it were a simple biological clock, when in reality, it's closer to a rough visual side effect with its own separate physics. And if you want to see this illusion at its most extreme, you don't need a funeral home. You need a museum. In naturally mummified remains, bog bodies pulled from peat, desert mummies preserved by dry heat, this exact dehydration and retraction process didn't stop after a few days. It kept going, slowly for centuries, sometimes thousands of years, locking the illusion in permanently. When you look at photographs of remarkably preserved mummies with long, dramatic-looking nails and hair, you are looking at the exact same mechanism happening to a normal body after death, just given an almost unimaginable amount of time to run its course. The myth that started at a bedside,
Or an open casket and the ancient mummy in a glass case at a museum are the same physical process, separated only by scale. So, where did this myth actually come from in the first place? Because a purely visual illusion doesn't automatically become folklore. Something has to plant it, and there's a real historical horror buried underneath this one. Before doctors had reliable ways to confirm death, people were sometimes buried while still alive. It happened often enough that exhumations occasionally turned up coffins with scratch marks on the inside. Bodies shifted from their original position, evidence of a struggle.
that took place after burial, not before. Some historians argue that the nails kept growing story isn't really a description of ordinary corpses at all. It's a folk explanation people reached for after encountering something far worse. A body that had clearly moved, clearly struggled, and needed some kind of story to make sense of what they were looking at. Long nails and wild hair were easier to process than the alternative. And once that image existed, culture ran with it in exactly the wrong direction. Old vampire stories, ghost legends, gothic horror written centuries ago all used growing. Hair and nails as a symbol of something unnatural persisting after death, a body refusing to fully die, still quietly alive in the dark. But the biology says the opposite. This effect isn't a sign of continued life. It's a sign of the body actively drying out, tissue pulling back, moisture leaving, everything shutting down further and further from that moment of death onward. The horror writers had the metaphor backwards. It was never a symbol of persistence. Nothing in that image ever grew. Nothing kept living in the dark. What you're actually looking at is tissue that spent days, weeks, sometimes centuries, quietly losing moisture and retreating, exposing keratin that stopped being made the instant the body stopped working. The illusion is real. The growth never was. And the next time someone tells you that story at a funeral, or you see it in an old horror movie, or you stand in front of a mummy in a glass case somewhere, you'll know what you're actually seeing. Not a body that kept living past its own death. Just one, quietly and precisely, drying into stillness.